You're listening to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy. Welcome to today's book talk for Artfully Teaching the Science of Reading by Chase Young, David Page, and Timothy Rosinski. This is an important topic in literacy because many educators aim to be artful or creative in their teaching. But before we can add art to reading, we have to really know the research and science behind it. Let's jump in. Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. Today, we are hosting a book talk, and we are going to be talking about artfully teaching the science of reading. So we love book talks, right, Melissa?
Yeah, it's like one of my new favorite things that we do.
I know. We're just doing them for every book that we're podcasting about. So it's really fun because this is such an interesting way to think about this topic, to think about science of reading artfully.
Yeah. So really exciting that we got to talk to all three authors for this book. So that will be coming out on Friday. So we have Chase Young, David Page, and Tim Rosinski, who's an old friend of our podcast. Yes. Yeah, really exciting to talk to all of them. And I think you're right. I think it pushed our thinking a little bit this week, and it challenged us in a good way, I would say.
Yeah, it did. It helped us kind of think outside our box. And it's really thinking about this book as a bridge between the two major strands of reading instruction that are often held at opposite sides of the spectrum, right? The science of reading and like creatively or artfully teaching reading. Right. And I think, to quote my favorite Dr. Becky, two things can be true. We can use reading science, and we can also be artful, creative teachers.
Yeah. And I think it's, sometimes you think when you think of science, you think, no, that means there's one right way to do it, and that's it. and
I think sometimes that often, like in our head, when we think about it, it might look like a robot or feel robotic or feel very like structured or stilted, but that's not really the case,
Yeah. But that there can be a balance of those two, which I think is great, right? That doesn't mean throw out the science and just do what feels good, right? But that there is a balance of these two things, which it's hard to find that balance, but it's good to remember that there is a balance.
Yeah. I'd like to give an analogy, and then I'm hoping that you can be like a truth speaker for us, Melissa.
Ready.
So I'm thinking about building a house, and reading science and high quality materials, they're the foundation. They're the framework of the house. But then once the house is built and, the frame is built and all of the things start to go in, like the floor and the tile and the countertop, that's the artful stuff.
Right,
that's the creative stuff.
Yeah.
You can have fun with it. But only after the frame is there.
And it has to be solid, right? Solid. That has to be really solid.
Right.
Or you're going to be in trouble.
Exactly. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And I do think the science has to come first and the frame has to come first.
Yeah. And I think that's what gave us a little bit, I don't want to say it, it's what made us like sit in a place of uncomfortability. That's not a word. But
discomfort.
Discomfort is a better, that's the right word. That's what I was looking for. Because, we just talk so much on this podcast about how we didn't get trained in the science, how a lot of teachers are in the classroom right now and haven't had training in the science. And I think that's what made us just, pause for a minute and go, okay, hang on.
Well, it actually helped us a lot because you and I had a lot of longer conversations in depth about this. And then we were also able to talk more deeply with the authors about this and what their intent was, both off, like before the podcast and on the podcast.
Right. Yeah. Because you can't be artful if you don't have the like you said, the foundations. If you don't have that solid foundation there of what the science says about how to teach reading, then when you're being artful, I mean, you're putting on tiles that are just going to fall right off in a week.
Exactly. I think about it like before a child learns how to dance, but they're like just flailing all about, and they're just moving around, and then they might learn ballet moves, or they might learn some hip hop moves, and then they have like a structured dance, but then they can add their own flair to it. That's totally, the same idea as this one.
Absolutely.
With that, let's dive in. Let's talk about the structure of the book first. So Artful Teaching has kind of this idea that they are teaching with, or that we're teaching with, authenticity, aesthetically, and creativity. And we're using those three features and applying them to the 5 pillars, to assessment, to a connection to home.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about what those 3 things mean? Can we talk about those?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think authentic, probably people know already, but we'll say, it makes it real, right? It makes taking whatever's on the page and making it actually real for students, making some connections to them, making them feel like this, oh, why do I care about this, right? It's making it real.
For sure. And aesthetic means, reading instruction that educates the mind and the heart. So, how it feels.
Yeah.
Feels the emotional experience. And I think
why do I care about this?
Yes, that makes me think about, some of my favorite teachers. I think that's where I probably connected the most, in those aesthetic experiences.
Yeah. And then I think the creativity, they don't define it explicitly like they do the other 2, but it's woven throughout. And I think it's a little bit on both sides, right? Like letting the students be a little creative in some ways, but also the teacher, right? Letting the teacher have a little bit of creativity. So they're not that robot just reading from a script, right? But you're making it real for you as a teacher as well.
For sure. And I'm trying to look up the page. On page 6, there is a graphic that I think really encompasses what we're talking about here in terms of these 3 bigger ideas that lend themselves to the artful teaching. And that graphic looks like a big circle with a big thick outline that all around that outline says science of reading.
Yep.
And then inside is like kind of a triangle type of graphic. And it says authentic, creative, and aesthetic. And then in the very center, it says teacher judgment.
I mean, I love that. I love that the teacher is making the ultimate decision here of like when to do what, right? When to make it more authentic, when to be creative, when, to make it more aesthetic. Mm-hmm. But the like boundary, right, surrounding it is the science, right? So, you want to do those things, but you also want to keep it grounded in the science and not just go off the rails and just being like, just throwing everything out and then just doing what you want to do, right? As a teacher, what you think the students want to do, but making sure they're getting what they need. Yeah.
It's making me this is making me think about Natalie Wexler's very recent piece. And in that piece, she shared how when teachers were given high quality materials that they were shocked at what their students could do. And it came from there was like a 3rd grade teacher and a middle school teacher. There were teachers of different grade levels. And then also the students liked the repetition in the instructional routines. It made them feel comfortable. It made them feel like they knew what they were doing. It built their confidence. It helped them, feel like there was some continuity from grade level to grade level. And I thought, and also from school to school, right? They said it was the teachers that they interviewed were in a kind of a transient space, and both teachers and students would be shifted often. And that was very helpful there as well. So I kind of think that that's a really important thing to note, that those grounding features helped. And when teachers thought that students might not be able to handle it, that students surprised them. And I think sometimes, yes, teacher judgment is really important, but we also have to keep that in mind, that kids often surprise us with what they can do.
Well, that reminds me of, the TNTP report we talk about all the time, the opportunity myth, right? And, the judgments that you're making here should not be, I don't think my students can do this, so I'm going to make it easier for them.
That's a great point. The judgment should be something like, go ahead.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking based in the science of reading, how do I get them here? How do
I help them access this skill in a foundational skill lesson? How do I help them better understand the text here? How do I help them understand the vocabulary in this text?
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
I think that's a really important distinction.
That's really important. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. And we can link the study too for those folks who haven't read it. That's one of my favorites.
I know. We said we were going to do a little.
We said we were going to do a podcast on it.
Book talk. I don't know what we call that. That's not a book talk.
An article talk.
An article talk.
A research. We could do a research talk.
A study talk. Research talk. I like that.
Study talk sounds like a high school class period. So maybe not. We won't title it that. Let's do that.
The one other thing it reminded me of was I remember Kareem Weaver when we had him on. He kind of surprised me when he was talking about culturally relevant texts. I think we were talking about text specifically. But, I will say I'm no expert in culturally relevant instruction or texts, but he surprised me a little when he did say, don't tell me that kids can't relate to Shakespeare. They can. It's the teacher that has to make it relevant. And this reminds me of that a lot, right? It's like, okay, you might get a text that is not immediately something relatable to students, but like in Wit and Wisdom, how do you make it relatable? Okay, what is love, right? Like, okay, like now you have something that an eighth graders
are like, oh hey, I'm here,
right? Because, and I think that's what you're not saying, okay, we're not going to teach Shakespeare at all, just take it off the table. You're saying, okay, this particular text is not necessarily something I know my students can relate to right away, but if I'm a little creative with it and, appeal to those feelings and emotions that I know they have, then we can make a connection here and we can get to, helping them comprehend this text because I'm making it a little more relatable to them.
Yeah, that's so important. Thanks for bringing that up about Kareem too. That's it. I love that. I forgot about that. So let's think about how, we have to know the science in order to be artful. Mm-hmm. And the authors do propose that artful teaching is integrated into our instruction. So we thought we would talk about some examples. Melissa, do you want to talk about Kristen Poppins first?
Yeah, well, she popped into my head a lot during this because she has a curriculum, right? And we've said it on the podcast when we had her on and her team. They use units of study, which, we don't necessarily promote. We definitely don't.
I was like, that was very nice of you.
I know. I was like,
just for a second, that was
maybe too kind. But what she did was she went first on her own to learn the science, right? And she went and did her own her own study of some texts and learned what the science and research said about how to teach. And she went and said, okay, this is what is happening in my curriculum. I'm not throwing it out because it's our curriculum. It's what we have to teach. But I know there are things from what I just read that my students need. So for instance, she did a lot of work with phonemic awareness. And then her and her team, whole kindergarten team, did a lot of work with that. And they brought in the things that we talked about on the podcast, like using those sound walls, using rhyme mats, and not just using those things, but what comes behind it, right? Like teaching students the sounds of the words as they're also learning the letters so that, they're making more sense of it. They did all of that. They added onto it. And I don't think this is necessarily relating it to their lives or anything like that. But they were being creative with what they knew their students needed, right? So they're making that teacher judgment based on what they had and the science and making it work for their kids. I think some of it, when you watch the videos of the kids, so are they singing songs? They weren't really singing songs, right? It was more of like a chant that they had happening.
Yep.
But like that kind of thing was definitely motivating. And, the rhyme mats were something that, they were able to then, make it tactile so the kids could also like use, use their hands to see where the sounds were going. So just those kinds of things that they added those things on, right? Those were not in their curriculum. They just knew that these are helpful for their students to get them where they need to go.
Sure. And she thought about what was effective in like the guardrails that she had.
Right.
And that's what I think this is about. Like, what do I know to be effective? What does research tell me that's effective within the guardrails that I have? Now, like optimally, you'd have high quality materials and your guardrails would be a little bit wider.
Right.
But if you don't and you're limited, then that's a different place to be. And acknowledging that up front, I think is important because it helps you move forward knowing where you can go.
Yeah.
Like, where you can pull out and kind of push in.
Yeah. Yeah. And for her knowing like, okay, even though I have this curriculum that I don't agree with, knowing like, I'm going to take the 3 cueing out of this, right? Like when they get to those things that I know are just not what needs to happen, we're not going to do it. I'm going to skip right over it.
Right. I'm thinking about, in Baltimore, we have foundations and I'm thinking about for example, in level 1 foundations, one skill that students learn is to distinguish long and short vowel sounds. So, I was thinking if I wanted to be artful in that, I would teach the lesson as intended. I would stick to my tier 1 curriculum. I would teach my lesson. And then after that lesson, I would have students maybe practice sorting words into long and short vowel categories. And that would be the artful integration. So they could be working with a partner. They could be working independently. They could be working at a center. They could be working at a kidney table with me, with students who might need more support. And that's why I was thinking that artful piece would come in outside of what I've already taught in my tier 1. And that's what I think is important. We're not like necessarily changing things. Like you said in the beginning, we're adjusting to help the students that we have in front of us really solidify their understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
for a purpose. We're doing this for a purpose.
Exactly. Sorry. No, I was just saying, and those kinds of ideas like word sorts and word ladders, they're in the book, right? So if you want to learn more about those and others, they're in there so you can read them. But I was also thinking about Baltimore because, teachers have had foundations for a really long time. And then they got Haggerty on top of foundations. And I think the thing that brought it together in Baltimore was getting the letters training. So then they had this, they had the knowledge of the science of reading and they were able to say, okay, I have these 2 programs. If I just literally teach them both from the box, just as they are, it's honestly probably not going to, don't kill me, but it's probably not going to be terribly effective if you just literally do exactly what it says every single day, right? And having that teacher knowledge and being able to tie them together and say, okay, this is what's happening with phonemic awareness and Haggerty. This is what's happening in phonics with foundations. Tying these together, I'm seeing what my kids need, and I'm doing, these, extensions that are getting them even more practice for what they need. That's when things are going to come together.
You haven't even mentioned geodes yet, right? We have geodes.
I didn't. Yeah, there you go. A whole nother one.
Yeah. I mean, that's like another opportunity to be artful, and you can have students reading together. I mean, I think it's kind of about multiple things. It could be about the approach. It could be about the structure. It could be about the instructional routine. Being artful could be lots of different things. It could look lots of different ways, but at the core, it is keeping to what students need after we've taught that tier 1, after we've taught the standards, after we've taught the skills that we need to teach them, after we've taught, I don't want to say skills for comprehension, but after we've taught the text. And I think that that's important, or the curriculum. I think that that's important to say.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point too, of a lot of this could probably come, after you've taught something and you have some students who aren't getting it, right? That's probably where this is needed even more, because the kids that get it the first time, or it's probably never the first time, but maybe it is the first time. I shouldn't say that. But if they're not getting it, that's when I think you need to be even more artful, because something's not
different approaches
sticking.
needed.
Yeah.
Or extension. These are, I think, huge opportunities for those who need extension, or
Yeah. How do you,
another round of teaching or another couple rounds or just more practice, or maybe it's a way for students to connect around learning a new skill, or a new vocabulary word. There's so many opportunities here.
Yeah.
Or comprehension, right? Like hearing someone else's perspective and really stamping what's happening in the text for them based on what someone else thought might be happening. I just think it seems all of this is very exciting. Lots of exciting opportunities here.
Yeah. Do you want to dive into comprehension? Are we ready for that?
Mm-hmm. I think we should.
Because I think that one's a little messier or fuzzier.
It always is. Yeah.
Oh, it always is. Of course.
Always. Comprehension is complicated.
Yeah. But I think I was a little nervous for the book at first because I do think a lot of times I hear that, what we hear from the opportunity myth is just like, oh, well, this book is hard, or my kids aren't going to like this book. Can we just have a different book?
Yeah, I see that a lot on social media too. Yeah.
Yeah. That would be the choice that the teacher wants to make is just, let's just scrap this book and do something different.
Well, and in all fairness, we've told the story 100 times. You and I also thought well, why don't we just change this when we were first reading through Wit and Wisdom? Remember, our first cold read of it, we were like, let's just change this and that. Your innate, our innate impulse was to change what we had in front of us, and then we realized, we can't change it.
Yeah. And I want to give an example from a teacher that I know here in Baltimore. Should I say her name? Do you think she would mind?
I think you should, because I think she's awesome.
She is awesome. So we have a teacher here in Baltimore, LaQuisha Hall. She was Teacher of the Year at some point recently. But she's a high school teacher. And, there was a book in our high school curriculum that didn't always go over well, which was Persepolis. And I think that was one of the immediate reactions was just our kids cannot relate to this, right? It's about the Iranian Revolution. That is just, they don't get it, right? And I just remember her, and I don't know her classroom well enough to know 100% what she did, but what I do know that she did was okay, this is a text that my kids aren't going to relate to immediately. But where can I find those ties? And I remember her talking a lot about just the the violence that happens here in Baltimore, and the violence that I forget her name. I was trying to remember the name of the character, but that the character was experiencing in Iran at the time, and how that affects you as a teenager when you're seeing these things happening around you. And when she was able to connect that to their world here in Baltimore and how there are similarities, even though it's not a war here in Baltimore, but some of what our kids are facing every day of the number of murders that are happening around them is definitely affects them, right? And when she made that connection, when she was able to say yeah, this is different, but there's some similarities, and you can feel similar to how she's feeling, then they were okay, yeah, I'm in this with you.
It makes me think about texts as mirrors and windows. Even if I had students who might not be able to outright, connect to that in terms of looking around their space and seeing that,
right?
I still think it's important for them to be able to look out that window and think, wow, there are other places in this world where people are experiencing that. And I think we would all want that for our children to not be confined by the four walls of where they live, or
right.
Yeah. And make sure that or where they're learning, and make sure that space is opened to them.
Yeah. And that's that aesthetic part, right? Of it says educating the mind and the heart, right?
For sure.
You're also being empathetic to other people's situations and what's happening in the world.
Yeah. I think some of the things that they mention in the book in terms of, creative demonstration of comprehension were things like reenactments, student-produced movies, writing parodies, comic strips, writing the author. And so much of this makes me think about, in Wit and Wisdom, the instructional routines, but also just in high-quality materials in general. This is baked in. You can see, a lot of these creative pieces baked in. One of my favorites is the tableau, and where students have to, essentially think about what's happening in a scene of the text and then create that scene using their bodies. And they don't actually move. It's just a non-moving portrait. And but it's not even about that moment that they recreate. It's about the 6-7 minutes before, when they are animatedly talking to each other, just talking about the text and talking about the characters or talking about what's happening, and then figuring out where they're going to stand and what their face is going to express and how their arms are going to be and their body language. And all of that is comprehension.
Yeah.
You have to understand what's happening in order to execute that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I think that's a lot of what, to me, that exemplifies like the creativity and the in teaching.
Yeah. And I love that you said, a lot of that is baked in. Like you can see some of this already there in the curriculum. So I love that, some of the artfulness has been done by curriculum writers, but that doesn't also mean you can't, as a teacher, add on to that, right? I know, like,
totally.
Here in Baltimore, Kier, who we've had on the podcast, I remember actually going to an event he held after they read Bud Not Buddy.
Yeah, I loved this.
And like every one of his kids made a suitcase of what Bud would have brought with him on his journey. And then he invited people to come in, parents, and I was invited, other people were invited, and the kids would tell like why they chose what they put in his suitcase. You could see their comprehension of the text by, what
through those choices.
Totally. And they just thought it was like awesome, right? they were like, this is so cool. But I could see it from that they understood this text because they can tell me about why they chose these things for this character. And another, I know we had the Skinny Atlas teachers and librarian on, they popped in my head because they did some of this too, right? Like they took a virtual field trip, but I think they're making those videos of the volume of reading texts. Like that stuff's not in the curriculum. That was them taking it like a step further.
Right. But it is motivating. It's connecting to students. It's providing them a real world experience, right? It's helping them to speak for maybe down the road when they're interviewed on a podcast or to speak when they have to have a job interview, right? They're recording themselves and then talking so that people can understand. They're communicating ideas. All of that is really important stuff to learn for the real world.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this book is talking about when they talk about artful connection to teaching and, artful connection to the science.
Yeah. And it's also just like motivating, right? Like maybe I don't want to just read another book in the volume of reading, but if I get to make this video after, like that's kind of cool.
Super fun. I mean, I just always think of my 5th grade class. I don't know why. I think that age just like they were so game for anything. And it just took like an ounce of an idea to make anything fun.
It's so true. I feel the same way about 6th grade. 6th grade was very similar.
Yeah, I know. I just think kids are, and I think part of it too is the way, like you said in the beginning, Melissa, when you present as a teacher and you are motivated and excited about whatever it is, that makes all the difference. If you went in and you were like, we're going to do this cool thing today called a student produced movie, they'd be like, wow, that's a lot of work, But if you're building it up, and I think teachers do this. It's so fun to think about the exciting way that we think about creatively enhancing what we have and then sharing that with our students. It brings so much love and joy to the classroom.
Yeah. 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 And I think, some of those things can be big, like taking field trips, things like that, but others can just be small. I remember I read A Long Walk to Water with 6th graders, and we tweeted the author. Like they all had to write a tweet to the author.
Fun. Did you tweet the actual author?
Yeah. And she actually wrote us back, they were like, what?
Oh my gosh, that's so cool.
Or tweeted us back. Yeah. But yeah, they just thought that it was so simple. It took, half of one period for them to do that. But it was just
because a tweet's very short.
Yeah.
But it has to be meaningful in those short amount of words.
Right. But then to get something back from the author, it was like, oh man, this just made it real.
Yeah. I just, the excitement that they would have that connection to an author is so cool. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
Fun. Well, I think this was a fun conversation to have because it helped push our thinking and helped us kind of connect two sides of reading that we don't always talk about on our podcast. So I'm glad that we had the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always say that I think we can get very black and white in education and tend to like do one thing or the other. So I think you bringing your Dr. Becky quote back up of two things can be true and reminding us, yes, we can. We can use a curriculum and we can follow the science of reading, and we can also be a little bit artful within that is really important.
Thanks for listening, literacy lovers. We release a new podcast episode every Friday and share more resources in a newsletter on Tuesday. Sign up for our newsletter at literacypodcast.com. Each week, you'll receive important information, resources, and connected content.
We're excited to create a space for community discussion about our podcast. We want to connect with our listeners and support you in answering your questions. But we also realize there are a lot of other educators out there who have great advice and experience too. Let's keep learning together in our Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast Facebook group, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
If the content in this episode helped you, share with a fellow educator and teacher friend. Our literacy lover community welcomes educators at every stage of their learning journey. We're so glad you're here to learn with us.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of the Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast in this episode are not necessarily the opinions of Great Minds PBC or its employees.